Fantastic. Really wonderful talks. So we now have some time for questions. I've been told I can go up until 1:05, take 5 minutes from your lunch if I need to. So we'll open the floor. You can raise your hand. I'll take your name if there's a lot of you. And we'll get the mic to you in the audience if you're not at the table. Sharon?
Thank you so much for these papers. My question is for Gabriele. Oh, I have to speak.
Sorry.
So my question is for Gabriele, and it's about the politics of trans-species imaginaries. And it's coming from a place of lots of sympathy, because I've been thinking a lot about what I talk about in terms of more than human political communities. And you identified at the end one of the big challenges to that, which is the epistemic challenge of kind of knowing the experience, the needs, and so on of non-human beings and things. But I have found, as I've been out and about talking about this project of mine on more than human political communities, that there's another kind of a worry that people have about this that's different or beyond the epistemic challenge. And it has to do with political equality. And you know, there is this feeling and a belief, and it's a reasonable one, that you know, political community is distinctive in being a community of something like mutual respect or reciprocal respect, at least when we're talking about democratic political community as it ought to be. And that the worry that people have expressed to me is that if we're thinking now about political communities that are really trans-species in your sense, or more than merely human in my sense, that we're going to have to face that up to the fact that the political is radically reconfigured, specifically in a way that takes it away from this kind of core defining constitutive commitment to equality. And so I wonder what you think about that. And how, you know, just what you think about that, and how you would think about trans-species political imaginaries in light of that.
Yeah, this is a very interesting and probably one of the most challenging questions when it comes to the politics of trans-species, whatever, imaginaries, politics, and so on. I struggle with a very parallel question when I read Bruno Latour. You know, Bruno Latour in The Government, when he talks about the government of species, he talks as if every species has the same voice, but it's, of course, romanticizing, because it's still the humans who speak, and who speak for the other species. And this is, by the way, why I chose Samantha Frost and Sheldrake, because they are both thinkers who try to not dismiss anthropomorphism, but are trying to separate it from anthropocentrism. And I completely believe this is important. But what we have to fight is the anthropocentrism. But we need to retain anthropomorphism. And for me, as close as we can come to political equality is if, when it comes to deciding how our actions and our politics and our industries and technologies impact other species, that we imagine that they have the same rights as we do. But another caution against romanticizing that I have to insert here is not every species is benign. We have tried to fight the coronavirus now for years. And I'm far from the position. Roderick Nash, who wrote the first book against speciesism, once declared in front of an audience at my university that as far as he is concerned, the AIDS virus has as much right to live as any human, and therefore he thinks we need to suspend the medical programs that try to exterminate the AIDS. This is not where we can go, so it becomes very, very complex, and I don't have we certainly will not come to a position where we make political decisions with a bear at the table, but we can go a long way in trying to respect the life of species, biodiversity, but also understand, for me the most important is to understand the entanglement. And that includes the understanding, and included in our thinking, understanding the entanglements with viruses, bacteria, and so on. And to come back to the epistemological challenge, I thought the whole morning, I remember John starting off with talking about the radical uncertainty about the object of our study when it comes to literature. And I emphasized the radical uncertainty in many ways, and then Erin did in terms of different forms of grieving. I think tolerating, getting away from a position where we can never admit that there's anything we are uncertain about, is not compatible with an ecology of mind that I follow Bateson in thinking is necessary, where the changes have been. Radical uncertainty and being able to tolerate it, I think, is a centerpiece of that ecology. And there again, literature, I think, is precisely one of the genres that help us dwell in uncertainty. I was always most fascinated by reading a book that I didn't understand right away, that I had to struggle to think, why does it move me? Why does it touch me? I don't understand. Beckett, that's why I came back to Beckett here at the end. Yeah, I'll stop here.
I have Jacques next.
Thank you both. It's as though the conveners had planned these two talks to go together. They really shockingly marry. I have a question for Erin. I followed you and assented to everything you were saying until the very last gesture. The very last gesture is the one in which you imagine a universal dancing on the grave of the white European male. This does not affect me at all. I'm not a... and I wonder at that nostalgia for reintroducing, well, I mean, that's putting it tendentiously. I wonder at the gesture of reintroducing a kind of universalism at the end. Where does it come from? Why do you need it? Why not remain in the word difference?
Right.
And the word difference, actually, there are two iterations of it, and one is adverbial, differently. The other one is adjectival, as used by Lamar. the adjectival use is missing the noun that it modifies and leaves open the possibility that you're grieving for any number of possible things. So it seems as though the kind of universalism that you want at the end of the talk is a universalism without substances, grieving different
Without
substances. So it's grieving different, adjectival, without telling us what is being grieved. And I wonder if that doesn't put us into some of the areas that you were discussing, where you're lacking the specificity of an ethical relation, because you're forced into a situation in which grief is universalized by means of subtracting substance.
Thanks. Two really brief responses. One, so to mourn, in parentheses, or even dance on the grave of, quote, parenthetical, the ends of philosophy and the ends of, no, and parenthetically, the ends of European man is I'm citing Moten referring to Derrida as part of a gesture of trying to confront or wrestle with the end of philosophy or the end of a certain European man, which Moten is saying that Levinas thinks he's doing and fails to do. Okay, so I would say that the quotation marks and the parentheses are important in that just as sort of a strike through might assert and remove something at the same time, I want to, I suppose, propose a kind of undecidable relationship in that grieving. And in terms of, I think this is what you're referring to, although this is not what you said. So at the end of that same sentence, I said, to rhythm and to those who, in the words of Kendrick Lamar, quote, grieve different, which is to say, to us all. I added, which is to say, to us all, and then I took it out. I added it, and then I took it out, and then in the end, I left it. So if there were a way to write in this way, so our friend Willy Tyer, a wonderful Chilean philosopher, is really good at speaking and writing in this way, where he advances a thesis and then takes it back. But it's not as if he had never advanced it to begin with. And so I think I want to have a kind of a relation to a certain kind of universality that would be against the imperialist either erasure of or denigration of difference, which is why I think I say at some point it's neither translatable nor untranslatable. So I think I'm trying to propose a certain universalism that would go against more explicitly violent historical forms of universalism. I may have failed.
I have Hannah next.
Thank you both for these enlivening talks. I just have a question for Gabriele, which is, I'm very sympathetic and I think very much on the same page in so many ways. And I just wondered if you could reflect a little on a metaphor that came up throughout your talk, and then also even just now when you were answering, which is the metaphor of entanglement, which is I keep running into this everywhere. What do you make of it? What do we do with this this trope?
Yeah, it's ironic because I actually thought of taking it out because it has become such a buzzword and you have it everywhere. But then I had used it way before it became one, so I left it. What I mean with it is that, and what we know more and more about with the help of the sciences and the environmental sciences, but the microbial sciences and the life sciences more generally, is how much more deeply interdependent we are with environments and other species than we have believed. And I mean, the whole issue of thinking we control nature and we can take resource extraction to our advantage limitlessly. All of these long-held practices have now become known as being utterly self-destructive, not only to others, but self-destructive. And in a way, that's a good thing, because I think the knowing that it's self-destructive and it kills us, if we now sit in the plane and it shakes 10 times more than it shaked 20 years ago or so, then we realize, okay, these storms we have caused with climate change, they do something to us. They will get back at us. There will be a day we can't fly anymore because it's too dangerous. And that's what I'm in, these kind of things. But I have a feeling you had something more specific in mind.
I'm just noted, it just seems to be the word of the moment.
Oh.
I wondered if you, and yeah,
Yeah.
just.
Yeah. I mean, Sarah Nuttall has a really good book about, that's just called Entanglement, where she takes it in different directions. It's also a reflection on South Africa and South African books, but yeah, it's everywhere these days.
I just remembered that I didn't answer the last part of your question about the object of grief. And this is something I'm just beginning to think about, and I really would love to have a conversation about it, which is that, we know when we forget that the object of our affection, the object of our grief is and is not, it always exceeds itself, right? So, Cesar Reira, Michelle, are you still here? You'll remember that wonderful scene in the literary conference where he goes to the pool at the hotel, the protagonist, and he sees a woman in the pool with whom he immediately falls in love. And there's this wonderful passage about how she then joins a link or a chain of all of the women with whom he's fallen in love, right, throughout the years, so that object of his affection is always necessarily connected to each, right, instance of each other supposedly individual object. And I think grief functions in the same way. But I would love to have a longer conversation about that. And I feel like objects and things seem to be something that we're in both of us.
Emily? So, my question's for Erin. Thank you.
Please don't ask me about translation.
so
Please don't ask me.
When I first when I saw your choice of concept word, exposure, I sort of said to myself, obviously too patly, oh, she's going to really orient us to all these years later, to the great symptomatic reading debate, the digging below the surface, the just reading, the surface reading, Althusser, Jameson, Marcus Best, et cetera. And interestingly, obviously that's not what you were talking about at all. So the question really is, could you connect in some way what you were getting at to some of those debates? I mean, that's a tough one. I'm not sure how I would go about it, but it seems to me that since this is the literary edition, and that was such a monster debate, and led us into the byways of the post-critical, the stakes were big, one way or another, and I wondered if that was something you considered thinking about.
great question. Thanks for not asking me about translation. Like, am I really going to give them, like, refer so many times to translation with Emily in the room? So had I been invited to this meeting a couple of years ago when I was finishing my book, Anarchaeologies, this is precisely what I would have been talking about. Different approaches to reading as misreading, right? So I think exposure is a really wonderful way in, and I actually don't talk about it in that precise way, but I propose the idea of anarchaeological reading as a way that kind of for Latin Americanists brings back deconstructive reading as a practice that would attend to blind spots, opacity, misunderstanding, or error in a text, as opposed to an archaeological reading in which one would dig up some kind of aletheia or buried truth, or unbury the buried truth. Exposure in political terms often takes that form, and I compare it to inquisitional logic, or the logic of torture, where I torture the body of the other in order to extract that unburied truth, right? And I demand that truth before the law. And I say that anarchaeological reading does not carry out exposure in that way, in that sort of demand for complete transparency, but rather sets up a situation. And I think that Levinasian exposure allows us to do this. In this way, he moves away from thematization by kind of describing a transparent approach to the other in which I would comprehend the other, but rather enter into a relation where I do not have full access. I don't have that kind of imperial knowledge of the other or of the other within, right? So it's not merely the other person. It could be an otherness within, or it could be another species, I would say. Levinas does not sufficiently do that in any way. So I would say that's kind of where I would go with it.
I have a gentleman in the audience.
Hi, so I have a question for Professor Schwab. It's actually a follow-up from Professor Krause's question. So we talked about the epistemic as well as the political, and I'm wondering if there's something, the difficulty to move from or to distinguish even anthropocentrism from anthropomorphism has some kind of ontological aspect to it. Spelled by ontological, I really have in mind like Kant's anthropology. You know, we are the kind of creature capable or possessing dignity, whereas animals don't. I'm just wondering how if at all, can we kind of argue against or counter that kind of pretty large claim? And I just feel like that is the philosophic claim that is also reflected in many of our practices. For example, human rights presuppose that we have dignity, and human rights is I think an essential part of our life. So how do we achieve that kind of transition to have, as you put it, transpecies imaginary? At the same time, I feel like there's this huge historic philosophic inheritance that seems to just block it every time we try to achieve it. Thank you.
Yeah, let me begin with where you ended. I think you are right that a large part of our philosophical inheritance is blocking this kind. So it will require a radically new way of thinking. And the way I make the distinction between anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism is anthropocentrism takes for granted that human is the superior species, that all our actions should be, humans' interest should be at the very top, and then perhaps the charismatic species that we want to keep around, especially the companion species and so on. And then way at the bottom, the old hierarchy. Anthropomorphism is for me a way of trying to understand. And the Sheldrake quote at the end is a very good example for me of an anthropomorphic attempt to think. Can we think that someone speaks, of course, metaphorically, without a mouth? Can we think that trees communicate? Now there is a flood of research about the communication of trees, even trees warning other trees at a great distance. But then you can think about these trees in anthropomorphic terms. You can think about these trees thinking that they, if they see danger and want to protect trees at a distance, there is something we can relate to. So that can help to change our attitudes. And to come back to the whole question of grief is also interesting. I mean, if we think about Judith Butler in Frames of War, pose the question, how do we learn to grieve at a distance, especially in the age of mass media? How do we learn to grieve at a distance? I think I think we also have to ask, how do we grieve species that we subject to unnecessary suffering? If the species is so alien to us that it's hard to generate feelings like empathy or compassion. And there's a good example, Astrid Schrader, a teacher of communication. She taught Cornelia Hesse-Honecker's meticulous science painting about mutant insects she found in the vicinity of nuclear power plants. And she came with the ethical position that here there is evidence of how our power plants make these insects suffer. And there was a huge revolt in her classroom when one of the students said, why should I care about these damn insects? There's so much human suffering in the world that I think it's a luxury concern to, and a luxury feeling to have compassion with these insects. And there I come back to entanglement, because if once we understand the entanglements and even the dependency of our own species on insects, only then can we force ourselves, train ourselves, because it doesn't come naturally, to think differently and to not think all that counts is human suffering will be at the top of the hierarchy. Of course, we would still probably in a concrete situation try to save a human before we save an insect, but it's a general way of thinking about other species. And the latter one, I think, is anthropomorphic, but not anthropocentric. And it goes against a lot of the philosophies you mentioned. Yeah.
Gabby, can you just clarify one point related to this? When you're referring to, now I'm forgetting who it is, when you talk about speaking without a mouth, hearing without ears.
Oh,
you had me until then interpreting without a nervous system. What might that look like?
Yeah, that's Sheldrake. Trees don't have a nervous system.
How do they interpret?
But they obviously become aware of a danger that is at a distance they have no sensory organs to perceive, that we wouldn't be able to perceive at a large distance. And they warn the trees through roots in the mycelia, the roots in the ground. And this warning system functions without a nervous system. And that's, we can call that, again, in an anthropomorphic sense, we can call that they interpret what they sense in whichever way. They interpret this as danger to these trees at the distance. So that's an interpretation.
Let's bookmark that.
Man, mycelia is where it's at. I'm going to go ahead and collect up the remaining questions since we're running out of time, but I have Maya, Adi, Tim, and Akil. So if you guys want to go ahead and give your questions.
Okay, I want to just echo Jacques that it was very enriching to hear the two talks together, and I just want to ask about the theme of radical receptivity, which I think was articulated by both talks, but not in absolutist terms, which I really appreciate. And I just want to start with that really wonderful and disturbing quote from Levinas, where he says that you showed, Erin, that the moral obligation or the responsibility to the other is a passivity even beyond passivity, and that it's even before freedom. So the responsibility to the other for him is not even an expression of freedom, which is really striking. And I guess what I'd like to ask of Levinas and also to the thinkers that you are drawing on, Gabi, is how do we hold on to what may turn out to be distinctly human, while also engaging in this radical openness to the other? I mean, it strikes me, for example, that Kendrick Lamar articulates exposure differently from that passivity beyond passivity, whereby the human is just dissolved totally into a larger category. And a second question for Gabi: do you see trans-species imaginary as a kind of metonymic extension of the critique of individualism that we see in Levinas? In other words, and this is really for you both, to what extent does individualism continue to be a barrier, both to the trans-species imaginary, but also to the imaginary of exposure?
Adi?
Thank you. Thank you for wonderful talks. I have one question for Gabriele, or a request, to think for a moment a little more than you said in the talk about the relation between the trans-species, the biological trans-species that you talked about, and the technological one. And I have in mind John's talk. Well, I would like to call them what was in the background, or I think throughout the talk, the monsters, technological monsters. So if you can bring them back into this imaginary that you referred to in the beginning. Entanglement, biocultural creatures, this applies, of course, to these machines. And yet the moral interpellation is very different. We are called to be much more responsive, expose ourselves to the suffering of certain creatures, or these living creatures, and we are called to be very, very aware of those other creatures, and it's to opposite directions, I would say. So I invite you to say something about this. And to Erin, I want to ask something about a quote from, invite you again to say something more about a quote from Levinas that you put on the screen. And I should say in the beginning, am indebted to Levinas in my work. So this is a critical question vis-à-vis Levinas. So it doesn't come without deep respect. But he irritates me as much as in painting, red reddens and green greens.
I was hoping you'd ask me about that. Okay, go on.
I mean, this is obviously false. In painting, red seems to me reddens, and green seems to me greens. Seems to me. There are conditions for this experience of the reddening and the greening, or whatever he ascribes to the painting, or to the rhythm, or to the music, or whatever. I mean, suddenly, the phenomenological, well, not so suddenly, but the phenomenological investigation forgets the observer or the spectator or the one who senses all this, and it disappears, and with it disappears the conditions for being able to grasp the reddening of the red, which of course are not universal conditions. All the differentiation that you brought Lamar in order to bring them back, I think, the specific, they grieve like this, and the difference of grieving, it's already there. I mean, the erasure of the differences is already there in this way of speaking without, there's no gender, there's no subjectivity, no conditions for a subjectivity that is capable of experiencing something like this, etc., etc. So I think that it is the problem is maybe deeper than what you suggested, but maybe missed something.
Tim?
I think you've been asked versions of my question, both of you. My question is for both of you, because I also am sort of moved and impressed by this, the theme of radical receptivity, as Maya put it in both of your papers. But in both there is a limit, implicit or explicit, in that principle. Very interestingly, Gabby, you were talking about, the AIDS virus, the coronavirus. You yourself want to register a limit in your principle there. And implicitly, Erin, the reading of, I thought was totally fascinating, your reading of Moten on Levinas. But there's also an implied limit. There are presumably texts that you would yourself not want to quite extend the form of radical, exposure that you in a way implicitly critique Moten for not extending the passivity beyond passivity to Levinas. There are presumably texts that would not warrant for you the kind of generous, sort of post-critical, uber exposure as a reader that you're implicitly criticizing Moten from withholding from Levinas. And so I'm sort of asking you to confirm that or sort of deny it. I sort of think that that's the case. But I was interested in the ways in which you both sort of navigated that question by saying, oh, I put universalism in, or I both put it in and take it out. Gabby, I both wanted to use entanglement and I put it out and took it in. In other words, you're in a crucial moment, you're sort of creating a something like a literary or even a fictional relationship to the terms that you're using. It's as if you're suddenly become a fictional character. I use it, but I also don't mean it. So I'm interested in that dimension of the literary that is sort of in a hidden and suppressed way exists in your expositions.
And a final question from Akil.
Gabriele, I was you're invoking anthropomorphism, but in response to your question, I was wondering how much the effectiveness of anthropomorphizing, in the sense that you have in mind, turns on getting right a certain view of metaphor and getting it right in the political and public culture at large. I don't mean just in literary departments and philosophers and so on. So here's what I had in mind. If it's anthropomorphizing, then one is making a metaphor in attributing certain properties. And there is, for that to be effective, the culture has to appreciate the fact that it's not just that a metaphor is unparaphrasable, which I think everybody agrees, unparaphrasable into literal statements, but that's just a thesis about language, about the nature of metaphor as a linguistic phenomenon. But a thesis about language must have a counterpart in ontology or metaphysics, and that is that a metaphor is, an effective metaphor, a good metaphor, is capturing some reality that no other, that can't be, it's capturing some fragment of reality that can't be expressed by anything but that metaphor, right? I mean, that's the ontological counterpart to what is widely accepted, that metaphors aren't translatable. And unless one has that understanding of metaphor completely widely dispersed in the culture, there's going to be suspicion of anthropomorphizing. So, I mean, in a sense, it really goes back to what John was saying in the morning. Ever since the 17th century, we hold these things in suspicion, partly because science of a certain kind has come to be so central in our culture that we don't have this ontological sort of counterpart thesis to our ordinary understanding of metaphor. And I don't believe that the appealing to anthropomorphizing in the way you did is ever going to be effective unless we have a much wider change of this kind. I'm sorry, I may not be clear, but I do think that it goes to deeper issues of that kind.
Okay, we've only got about 5 minutes left, but I'll let you guys fight it out.
Do you want to? Okay, since we only have 5 minutes, thank you for these rich questions. I wish we would have an hour, but I'll try to go through very fast. Maya, how do we hold on to what is distinctly human? I think we will always inevitably hold on to what is distinctly human. I think the more we become mindful of our entanglement with other species, the more humane we might become. It's expanding an ethical values that we only reserve for humans to more outward. I didn't quite get why trans species would be a metonymic extension of individualism. So there I would ask back, but perhaps we can do this. So to Adi's question about the technological species, the technological monsters. I usually end my classes on transspecies imaginary with two books. One is Robo Sapiens, which is a book, an older book by a group of robotic scientists who study and try to project the future of robotics. And they have an entire argument about will we come to the point that we have to define robots as a new species, give them rights, like will we have to include them in the human rights debate? And inevitably, those debates always come back to the question of emotion. As soon as they have emotion and are able to suffer, we have to do it. But there are some roboticists, it's controversial, their debate, but some are absolutely convinced that it will be able to, they will be able to bring robotics to that stage. The other book is Robocalypse, a sci-fi monster story, which is, of course, the old fear that the robots will turn against us and wage war and will want to exterminate humans. It's not as an answer, it's only as yesterday, there's a great science fiction bookstore just around the corner, and I picked up a book, The Strange Bird, and I only just began reading it, and it's a bird that's part bird, part robot, and part human, engineered in a distant future, and it's written from the perspective of the bird, who, of course, conveniently can think in human terms and with a human mind, but with totally different emotions. I don't know where I will go if I ever will include this in my project. I tend not to think that I will go there, but it is definitely a debate that has started. Okay, Tim, just very fast on the limits of radical receptivity. For me, the limit would be very clearly where a species poses a lethal threat, not only to human life, but also to the balance of a sustainable planet. And the interesting part is the species now that pose such a threat. Many scientists argue that they have evolved because of already human intervention very briefly, the viruses that were contained for however long in the rainforest come out because of the deforestation and species migration and so on. Okay, now to the most complicated question about the effectiveness of anthropomorphism. I still want to hold on to it, and I will ask you more in the next 2 days. I'm thinking about I started with the old forms of animism and the new animisms that Viveros, De Castro, and others have brought back into the debate. I just think I wouldn't ask the question, did they get it right in the contemporary scientific sense? I wouldn't put those down. You know, if indigenous epistemologies and ontologies take it for granted that some people are shapeshifters, I have to take that seriously if I deal with these beliefs and epistemologies. I don't have to embrace it for myself, but it is a world system and a cosmological system. And you said it has to capture some reality, but it definitely, the old forms of animism definitely capture a psychic reality of the people who embrace the belief in shapeshifters. So why this is related to the anthropomorphism debate, all these animisms are based on anthropomorphic projections on animals. Yeah, I'm also thinking...
But my point is that we've lost a certain centrality of trope and figurative language, which the period of animism had. And that's why it's not so obvious that we can just present your response to your question without actually looking at the wider sense of what we've lost. You know, a much larger thing we've lost with the passing of animism to the kind of culture we live in. And I think metaphor is central to that. The place of metaphor is central to that shift and loss.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little bit of a warning here from our coordinators that we need to kind of come to a close so that we can get the panelists off to lunch. So although we're going to give Erin a little moment to respond, and then we'll you guys can talk at lunch. But Erin, you want to take a quick 5? And
Sure. Thank you, Maya, Tim, and Adi. So this passivity, more passive than all passivity, is, I think, an attempt, perhaps a failed attempt, to get beyond an oppositional relation between passivity and activity. It seems to me one of a series of examples of places where Levinas is, this is why I call him Levinas after Derrida, is responding to, taking very seriously and trying to respond to Derrida's accusation that he's kind of trapped in this prison house of metaphysical language. So I'm picturing him in this prison and like listening to what happens as he's shaking the bars, right? And like what sound does that make and what do we do with it? I don't think he ever gets out. But why passivity more passive than all, why this poetic anaphora? Why, it's not just hyperbole. It's not just the most passive passivity you could ever imagine. I don't think that's what he's doing. And I don't think that whatever potential this idea has ever really comes to fruition in his work, but rather we see it in Spectres of Marx when Derrida talks about passive decision as a kind of decision or action that would guard its own impossibility, as opposed to a sovereign decisionism, which is complete and dominant and relying on the friend-enemy divide, et cetera. So it seems to me that Derrida does something to Levinas. Levinas says, okay, this is as much as I can do with it, and throws it back, and then I think we really have, Derrida wouldn't call it a concept, but the idea that, that would push us beyond this extreme passivity. I would not call it a radical receptivity. I think we could think about that in the context of what you're talking about, Gabby. In other words, it's not so much that we don't make political decisions, but that we make political decisions as a response to what has happened to us when we've been in been through a hurricane, or in other words, there is a certain passivity that happens that is related to a necessary activity. Related to freedom, I just rediscovered a line in Otherwise in Being where he says, "I'm responsible for the other's freedom." So that's a kind of different way of thinking about freedom. So it's not a primary freedom. It's not I am, right, and then I'm responsible. But rather, I am primarily responsible, and what I am responsible for is the freedom of the other. I know, Tim, it sounds like I'm celebrating and advancing this as an ideal, and I'm really trying not to do that. I think it's like temperamentally, I'm a very like optimistic, positive person, but I think I'm trying to be really critical here. So it sounds like I'm being really excited about it, but in fact, I'm really trying to underscore the risk and the violence. And in fact, I talk about Levinas's ethics as violent ethics, in fact, not as an ethics of nonviolence, but as a profoundly, traumatically violent experience. And then Adi, I thought you were going to ask me, because one of the other things I took out of parenthetical was red reddens and green greens is a biblical syntax. I mean, that's biblical Hebrew to me. Like I hear sort of, I don't know if you've read Robert Alter's recent translation where he's kind of glossing the relationship between noun and verb, in which there's a sort of repetition with a difference in the Babel story. So I think, again, it's another example of him trying to think through a relationship between nouns and verbs. He's trying to think through temporality, but it's so peripheral. I mean, it's so peripheral to the rest of the argument, even though it's very much related to what he's trying to do more generally in Otherwise Than Being. But art does not have this status anywhere else, right? It's like 2 pages. And so he's instrumentalizing. He's turning to these examples that for him allow him to think through temporality in and beyond language in these non-linguistic examples. But ultimately, he's not really describing what happens either in the painting of painting or in the witnessing of painting. I don't think he is capable of doing that.
It's something like taking from Heidegger from the work of art.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry we had to cut that short because it was a great conversation, and thank you all. Thank you for your wonderful papers, and thank you all for listening. We're going to take a lunch break, and folks should be back by 2:45 for a panel with Hannah Freed-Thall and Emily Apter.